On January 23rd, 1855, a bridge opened over the Mississippi River in a place we call Minneapolis. That year, Walt Whitman published Leaves of Grass, and the U.S. Camel Corps was created. Violence broke out between Irish Catholics and German Catholics in Kentucky, pro-slavery and anti-slavery vigilantes in Kansas, and Lakota and U.S. soldiers in Nebraska. Charlotte Bronte, the author of the first major feminist novel, passed away. Frederick Douglass published his seminal book, My Bondage and My Freedom. Two towns called Faribault and Northfield in the young Minnesota Territory were platted out. This is the 1855 History Podcast, a podcast about Minnesota, the 19th century, and doing history. I'm Logan Ledman. With me today, as ever, is Sam Temple. And Sam, we are now almost at the very end of our review of Ken Burns' Civil War documentary series. We just watched episode 8, and that's what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, let's do some history. History will be done. We talked last week about the clickbait title that is Ken Burns' worst episode. The question mark was the raise it.
That's right.
Pitch there. That was a question mark is what I was indicating. And a lot of interesting discourse around there. I was expecting, based on the comments, the rhetoric that we've gotten, the back and forth from previous episodes that sort of were designed to engage debate, that there would be more divided opinion among people.
Maybe we should go through some of our comments.
Oh, you want to go through some of the comments? I will pull those up here. We have, so as usual, we have comments on our initial Facebook post. That's just straight on there. And then we have some comments in some of the history groups that we have through Facebook. One person says, Tom writes in, thanks for writing in, Tom. Our perception of Confederate quote-unquote heroes has changed considerably in the intervening years. Hearing men like Lee, Jackson, and Forrest described in such laudatory terms is startling now. And I thought that was a really good point, and that was something that we have talked about extensively on the podcast, that it can actually be it can be uncomfortable when those moments come up in this documentary that, frankly, isn't old enough to be given, I think, that amount of, well, it was a different time, you know?
Right. Here's one thing that I'm thinking, Sam, is that one thing that's interesting is that a lot of people, I think, in 1865 would have been surprised to find out that in 120 years, Nathan Bedford Forrest was being described as a hero in some way, or being described in laudatory terms. Remember that with a lot of this overwhelming praise for Confederate leaders didn't come from their contemporaries during the Civil War, but came from the decades afterwards, solidified in the late 1800s and early 1900s, after plenty of them were already dead and gone.
Right. The celebration and the deification of Confederate heroes and what we now call the Lost Cause didn't come about until the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of the Jim Crow South, and then a spike again in the 1920s with the initial resurgence of the KKK in the 20th century. And then again during the Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s and 60s. That's really where a lot of our modern perception of these Confederate figures. Let's look at a few others. Neil says Ken Burns is very biased to the East, as evidenced by his series on baseball. That's interesting, and maybe we'll be going through baseball soon. I'm a baseball guy. I know you're more of a football guy, Logan.
Yeah.
That's really the stark difference between us. But not because one of our teams wins, and we both root for Minnesota teams. So we can still commiserate, but neither of us are interested in watching each other's sports. So we might turn to Ken Burns' baseball series, which I believe he made right after, that was made not too long after the Civil War one, I believe. Jim says, and this is some hot goss. Jim says, I've learned that Ken doesn't like to admit to or correct mistakes in his documentaries. Arrogance, perhaps? Questioning face.
That's a good question.
Interesting.
Interesting. I feel like other viewers have mentioned the term arrogance before with Ken Burns. Maybe it was him. Maybe he's a repeat. It's possible. To be honest, Sam, we haven't watched any interviews with Ken Burns about his series
No.
as part of this, and perhaps we should for our last episode or as a recap once we finished the series. That would make sense, I think. That could be very fun. And maybe we'll get a sense of whether there is something to be said about Ken Burns' personal qualities.
All right, now we're going to turn to just a few comments from some of the Facebook groups that we shared too. One is coming from Michael that says, Burns was so enamored with Shelby Foote that he treated his anecdotes and evaluation of Forrest as gospel truth. And you said something similar in the last episode, that Burns being so in love with Shelby Foote kind of shot himself in the foot there, if you will, with some of the storytelling aspects.
Yeah, great point. It's tough to see such a comprehensive and broad documentary series be, I don't know, it feels very narrowed to be focused so much on Shelby Foote. Although Shelby Foote, again, as we've said, an incredibly engaging storyteller, a very fascinating man who is a pleasure to listen to. But as we've said many, many times, he needs to be balanced out. And I don't think there's anything wrong with including Shelby Foote in a documentary like this. I think it heightens the documentary to have Shelby Foote's presence in this documentary. But it's most effective when it's part of a collage of contemporary voices, modern voices.
Yes. And one thing that you brought up last time is the other historians who have much higher credentials than Foote were used much less, which is, so it does become difficult to, I guess, defend the amount of Foote versus other people in this series. Just a few more here. One person just said hogwash. Unclear which side, that what we were saying was hogwash or what the documentary. Rory says, Burns' documentary is brilliant, but in hindsight, too soft on the lost cause and its attendant nonsense. So that got a couple reactions, a few responses. Mike says, it seems to me that Burns tries to straddle the fence a little too much, to which Tom responded, you mean present an objective history instead of a political accusation. Interesting. There's a little discussion here on the legacy and the skills of Nathan Bedford Forrest. Someone says, this is from someone, I wish I could tell you their full name because it's such a good name, but even their first name, I think, will paint a picture. Rex writes in and says, I wish this was shareable. We could share it to Ken Burns' Facebook page to have him comment on it and teach us. Then Sam responded, cut and paste with an attribution, problem solved. Rex then responded, someone should do that so we can hear from Ken. So Rex, if you hear from Ken Burns in reaction to our documentary, Mr. Rex, you please reach out.
That's right.
And if you just want to guest on the podcast, Rex, I would happily have you so then we can share with our audience your full name, which is just a lovely name. I really, really appreciate it.
Okay.
And I think those are all the documents, all of the comments that we need to go through. I think it's time to take a break from talking about comments about Shelby Foote to talk a little bit more about Shelby Foote.
What do you want to say?
Well, this episode starts again with Shelby Foote.
Right. The Southern sense of defeat, right? That's what we start with.
I think so.
Shelby Foote talking about that.
It wasn't super engaging to me. I didn't think it was that interesting, especially when, so the format of this documentary is there's this cold open, and there's the Ken Burns Civil War title sequence. And then there's another cold open, and then there's the title of the episode. The second cold open starts with aerial footage and talking about the context of the war, building some of the stakes, which again, this documentary does a lot, is it either starts an episode saying there was fighting here, there was fighting there, there was fighting here, there was fighting there, or it starts with here are a bunch of other things happening in this year, kind of like how we start this podcast. But so I thought it could have been a more engaging opening sequence to start with the aerial footage and setting the stakes and setting the setting of everything. But instead, it's another Foote anecdote that doesn't, again, really add to anything. So
I think I would disagree
that was just a little
on this one. I think
Whoa.
That's right. Just that this episode as a whole really is about the last moments of the Civil War. And this is the moment in the arc of the series when the Confederacy loses. And I don't know how interesting his actual point is. The story that Shelby Foote tells is a story that is about, I think what Ken Burns' vantage point was, he has a clip of Shelby Foote telling a story that is about the legacy of the South losing, and Shelby Foote's view on how people remember and respond to it. And so that's why he chose it to begin his episode about when the Confederacy loses the Civil War. So in that way, I do think it's different from the episode last week in which the opening prologue had no relation at all to the episode. I think this is a situation in which he does use a clip from Shelby Foote that captures an emotion for the episode that Ken Burns is trying to get across. This is, like we've been saying, this is the episode when the war is brought to an end. We have William T. Sherman and his infamous march through the South, discussed in detail.
His famous neckties.
His famous neckties, his famous beard.
No, the neckties were the railroad tracks
that they
destroy along the way.
That's true.
You just thought I was commenting on Sherman's
that is entirely
fashion.
In character for you, Sam. I can't express enough how deeply in character that is for you.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. But unlike the neckties being what the railroad is called, the destruction that went across the South is not a light matter. One thing that the documentary briefly touches on is the plundering and the burning and the absolute razing of the South. And that was really brutal, and that can't be denied. And it really does seem that Sherman was intent on burning the Southern way of life as it was, just destroying any chance that the cause of this war could essentially rise again. And the documentary, I think, makes clear the desolation that was inflicted on the South and some of the motivation. They talk about escaped prisoners of war finding their Union colleagues, and that being a motivation for some of the brutality that was inflicted on the South. And I thought that was really well done. And I think it got across the perspective of the Union soldiers. It got across the perspective of the Southern civilians, of enslaved people. I thought that was a really interesting segment, and I thought that was a good kind of kickoff to the narrative of this episode.
Sherman is so interesting, and he's come up a lot in our reviews of this. He really is. He's one of very few people who he understands from before secession what the war is going to look like and what it's going to mean. And he also understands how it's going to end from the very beginning. There's that famous editorial he writes where he says, essentially, the South, you know not what you do when you secede. This can only end badly for you. He lists all the reasons why the Union will obviously win. And he has a clear eye about how the war needs to be won the whole way through. Fascinating character. And you're right that we talk about, there's a section in this particular episode called The Breath of Emancipation. And it talks about the thousands upon thousands of enslaved people who join alongside Sherman's march as it travels through Georgia and South Carolina. It would be great to get more information about that. I think that's something that we could have lingered on more. It'd be great to find. One of the strengths of Ken Burns is selecting characters to follow. We do that with Elisha Hunt Rhodes, for example, in this documentary series.
Yeah.
So if we, like, for example, finding the story of a person who escaped slavery in Georgia when Sherman's army came through or at any other point in the war and following them through this chapter would be very cool. And those stories are out there. They're fully accessible. I think that'd been really cool. That's what I would have tossed in if I were making this.
Yeah. And, maybe if you had an episode that, say, there wasn't a lot of narrative action happening and the stakes weren't really aligned and you just needed, something filler to get you to 9 episodes, maybe you could have done that for episode 7.
Yeah.
Something like that. A little snarky of me. I apologize. But I thought overall, this episode did a really good job of balancing the perspective, balancing going from the leaders and sort of the great man history figures to the common folk, to the lower level of everyday people. I thought this episode had a really good balance of that. And I was impressed in how they were able to straddle it and make people in leadership positions and people, a private in the army or a civilian, feel just as fleshed out, just as human, just as mortal as the other. And I thought that was really well done. But the one criticism that I have, and again, I hate to be, retroactively banging on about other episodes. Sometimes when something is done well, it highlights how it wasn't done well in other places.
Sure.
And there's about 2 minutes of screen time for a man named John Bell Hood, who was a Confederate military leader. Again, maybe 2 minutes max that he is a presence in this documentary series. And in that small time, you were able to understand the perception that he had, that the perception of him from other soldiers, the perception of him from leadership positions, and vitally, they illustrated his blatant racism. In under 2 minutes, something that, again, they failed to do for almost any of Nathan Bedford Forrest's coverage so far. But what we also got with John Bell Hood was a little bit of the background again of the Confederacy, which we still don't get a lot of. We don't get a lot of the internal squabbling, the internal relationships. One thing we do get in this episode is the perspective of 2 first ladies.
Right.
We get written accounts of Jefferson Davis and Abraham Lincoln through the perspective and firsthand accounts of their wives. One as the war was coming up victoriously, and one as they are abandoning and burning down their capital, all of which was incredibly engaging. I thought that was a really clever way to do it and contrast these 2 leaders from an external perspective that still gives a glimpse into sort of their personal lives and their intimate minds. I thought that was really well done.
Yeah. To your point about the background of the Confederacy, I think going beyond the internal political squabbling, there's also still very little about the home front on the Confederacy, about what is the ongoing destruction of the war, both from the Union Army and from the Confederate government, that in its collapse increasingly levies harsher and harsher taxes on poorer and poorer citizens, and confiscation acts, and a plethora of agricultural political moves that essentially places much of the South in poverty. There's very little discussion, if any, about the perspective of civilians and women, especially poorer women, in the Confederacy itself. Also true of in the Union, not a lot. We got the political Copperhead movements discussed in previous episodes to some extent, but it would be great to get a deeper dive into the civilian aspect of the war, because it is immensely important. It fleshes out more context for what it meant for most Americans.
Yeah, that makes sense. One big change in the Confederacy during this time was using enslaved people as soldiers in the Confederate Army, which Georgia Senator Howell Cobb points out that if enslaved people turn out to be good soldiers, then our entire system of slavery has been incorrect. He recognizes that there's a contradiction there, which I thought was a really interesting perspective.
Yeah, and worth clarifying, too, that the Confederacy passes a bill enabling the use of enslaved people as soldiers, but the war ends the Confederacy before any enslaved people can actually be used as soldiers. Right. Worth remembering, too. Although in places like New Orleans, mixed race people who, in the very complicated and unique racial strata system of New Orleans, there were some mixed race people who were slave owners in New Orleans and then who fought for the Confederacy briefly in the early part of the war. In some parts of the South, you'll find individuals who were forced into being cooks or laborers or things like that for the Confederate Army, but no soldiers, no enslaved people used as soldiers during the war.
Right, yeah. It'd be fascinating. I know you've done some research in New Orleans to hear more about that, and maybe we can share some of your findings with our listeners sometime.
Yeah.
At some time. I think that would be really interesting. This episode starts to get into what I imagine the next episode will cover in more detail. And it's a topic of one of my earliest historical fascinations, one of the things that I remember just being enthralled by when I first started getting into history, being able to read thicker books and getting into it and all that. And that is the assassination conspiracy around Abraham Lincoln, most famously led by John Wilkes Booth. But it has all of this rogues gallery of individuals, a fascinating group of people and how they all come together, the different things that they attempted. And I find that group and their actions so incredibly fascinating. I remember the book was Chasing Lincoln's Killer by James L. Swanson. Did you ever read that book, Logan?
No, sir.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite books on my shelf. Third grade, so seeing them come up again, seeing that story come up, I really enjoyed, and I wonder how much we'll get there. And I thought that in terms of setting up dramatic tension, that was really well done here, setting the stakes. We've gotten a little bit of Booth a couple times, done a few times in there, and this one again ends with to be continued. So I thought that was really interesting. I was shocked that in our second to last episode, we got surrender. I thought maybe it would be drawn out again. Again, the pacing, especially after the last one, felt really great. It felt like we covered so much ground in this one. So just really interesting choices in how they decided to block out what amount of time in an episode for the amount of time that passes in the history. I thought that was really interesting. And how did you feel about the telling of Appomattox?
It's a very classic telling, probably feels familiar to me because I imagine a lot of the truncated versions of the story that we've seen in our lifetimes, Sam, are based on this telling, I imagine. But, we hit the beats, Lee riding in as the glorious martyr and Grant in a symbol of generosity and unification, allowing him and his men to surrender in dignity and thus laying the pathway for the Union to come back together peacefully and put this whole thing behind us. So I think that I think it falls into that school of telling about the surrender, which is...
I thought using firsthand accounts of different soldiers of different levels, again, all through the ranks, I think to tell this narrative, I thought that was really well done.
Yeah.
The sort of perspective hopping. Naturally, there were a lot of great visuals that he could go off of, paintings and drawings and things depicting this, even if people weren't actually there to see it. And because this occurrence was so well documented, I trust that it's still romanticized, but that the facts themselves are relatively accurate.
Oh, yeah.
And I thought that was interesting because this is a romantic story that is justified, I think, by the primary sources that we have. So I thought it was really well told, and I'm interested to see what the next episode focuses on. If it gets it all into Reconstruction, if it talks primarily about the manhunts that followed the justice system immediately following the war, it'll be really interesting.
Yeah, I'm excited to see how this all wraps up. It's been quite a journey. Ken Burns has brought us to quite a few places here, but I'm glad we've been watching it so far, and I'm real excited to see how it all ends next week.
Yeah, I think a lot of my feelings about this episode will be determined by what goes on in the next episode to see how the pacing fills out. But I thought this one was certainly an improvement on last week's. I thought the pacing was where it needed to be. Again, the different perspectives of historical figures and the different perspectives of contemporary historians. I thought all of that balance was really good, just in terms of the pacing, but across the episodes, I think will be determined by how it wraps up next week. So folks will just have to tune in and see what we think next week.